Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about Jimmy O Yang's rise to success. Now, since this podcast often talks about Asian American success stories, I wanted to cover Jimmy O Yang because this guy is a comedian actor who is really starting to break out and achieve some noticeable success in the entertainment industry, and I thought it was well worth taking a look at. So I noticed him recently because he was the head lead in a Netflix original film that got a lot of attention called Love Hard. It was a classic rom-com, and it had a new twist because when's the last time you had an Asian American uh, as the male lead for a romance comedy in America? So it's definitely making waves. Yes, he does play the Asian nerdy character, but from that to some of the other roles that you might know him for, such as he was in Crazy Rich Asians, he's going to be in Crazy Rich Asians 2, and he was in Silicon Valley, and that's one of my favorite comedy shows. So he's starting to definitely make waves, and essentially, I decided to read his book. And he wrote a book a few years ago, back when he was still filming Silicon Valley, called How to American. And it's a comedic memoir of his life story. I think there's a lot of things that are relatable, entertaining, as well as some things that you could probably uh, inform yourself of and kind of improve your own life through learning from his story. So I want to share you, say, 10 things that I learned from the book and then give my review of the book. Now, hardcore viewers of my blog will know that I did publish a book summary and review of Jimmy's book a few years ago, but in the spirit of honesty and vulnerability, like Jimmy did in his book, I gotta be honest and say I did not fully read the book when I made that book summary and review. I was trying hard to read, and I just really couldn't get into it, and I ended up skimming parts of certain large sections of the book rather than reading it from cover to cover. However, since then, since Love Hard Success, I decided let's switch that up. So from there, I went ahead and got the audiobook for Jimmy O Yang's book, and I went through a lot of it. I still haven't finished it, but I am almost guaranteed to finish it because I tear through audiobooks, and I pretty much finished like 70% of the book in the last 2 days. So there's a lot I want to cover, and let's just get down into it because I think this his story is so interesting. There's some parts I disagree with, or at least have different perspectives, being also Chinese American, but having different experiences growing up, and some a lot of relatable, similar experiences. So he basically goes through his whole life, and this guy you can immediately tell is very witty and has a very kind of plain spoken way of describing his life, uh, starting from childhood, and how brutal his Asian parents are. Now, I actually rank for the term Asian parents number one on Google and have for many years. So I do get a decent amount of uh, children of Asian immigrants, telling me about their woes or leaving comments about it. So I know the general stereotype, and I think a lot of it holds true. But I do want to bring up a few of these. He lists a ton. Like I think his first few chapters was basically like a litany of Asian stereotypes. Not just when he arrived in the U.S., but before he had a lot of kind of stereotypical Asian parent things back when he lived in Hong Kong. So essentially, I want to go through a few of these. He basically lived in Hong Kong until I believe 13. He was originally from Shanghai, and they made fun of him. Uh, his classmates made fun of him because he was from Shanghai rather than Hong Kong, and since Hong Kong was colonized by Britain, they looked down on Shanghai as a kind of like a lower class. And so I found that very interesting how like no matter where you live and where you are in the world, usually other kids in school will bully you or make fun of you for subtle, small differences between you. And that's just a terrible part of human nature. I wonder why kids always do that. Is it because their parents never told them otherwise? But it does kind of suck. And he did put up with it fairly well. I think jumping into the fun, entertaining stereotypes. One, his dad is like hypercritical of like everything. He's like a walking Yelp review, as Jimmy calls it. And his dad would basically like critique everything and say it's the worst. Like if the rice isn't cooked well by his children, it sucks. If he goes to a restaurant and something's slightly off, like the service is bad, or they use disposable chopsticks rather than real ones, he'll be like, "This is complete garbage." They call themselves a high-class restaurant and they're using disposable chopsticks. So I found that very interesting. I think there's a generational tendency almost for that generation to just be kind of brutally honest. Not just Jimmy's dad, but his mom as well, and his aunt would just be like, in family reunions or gatherings, they'll be like, "Man, you're ugly. Man, you're fat. Man, why is your hair so long? You look like a girl." And so Jimmy joked that he had it burned into his skull that his identity was a skinny, lesbian, uh, overweight Asian lady uh, because of everything his family told him. And I found that very interesting. And I think why are Asian parents or Asian people of that generation so brutally honest? After being around that a lot, I think a lot of it doesn't necessarily come from negative intent. They're not being malicious. What they're doing is essentially just speaking what comes into their head. And some of it, I think it's individual as to why, how some people perceive it, but I think some people think they're actually being nice because they feel like, oh, the world is so full of facades and people trying to filter what they say. Isn't it refreshing or nice for someone to actually tell you to your face that you need to lose some weight? And I guess part of it comes from that belief that they're helping them by being one of the rare folk to be brutally honest and candid and give them some good advice. I think the issue is oftentimes it's delivered very viciously and unintentionally, just very like, boom, you look fat, and it doesn't come off in the right way. So I think that's part of the issue. So I think that's it's very interesting how a lot of people will do that. But yeah, I think it's just family. Another stereotype. If you cook the rice wrong, you get yelled at, screamed at. Uh, if you disappoint your parents in any way, that's a big issue. And the dad kind of uses guilt and disappointment as tools and will like if you do well, you don't get praise or anything. It's just kind of like flat, like non-reactive. But then if you do poorly, then it's like boom, he's super upset. And I've spoken about these topics in my blog posts and basically uh, brought out like principles around how I don't think they're ideal parenting traits. Now, I think a lot of Asian parents do many things right for their children, which, I wouldn't say balances out, but I also try and kind of paint a more full picture when some of my Asian readers say, "Oh, my parents are just nothing but terrible." Sometimes that's true, but I've heard a lot of different opinions on this, and some of the parents, some students are very happy and proud of what their parents gave them and try and repay that back. So, you know, there's another stereotype in the book that I found very interesting, which is his dad really wanted him to do well in school. So they moved to the US because that's where all the like best education is. Uh, and most people who are in other countries see the US as the best place for education, except for, as Jimmy jokingly says, actual Americans. Uh, and he remarks how maybe they just take it for granted since they were born here, or they think the grass is always greener. But he made a few remarks on how his whole family moved here, made sacrifices to give the children a better life and education. Whereas I think a lot of Americans, they don't see America as the land of opportunity because they've just been born here and they take it for granted, and they don't know what they don't know about uh, the differences in opportunity elsewhere. Now, he doesn't dive too deep into this, and I wish he did, because I would have loved to learn more about like some of those differences. But I mean, he said enough about how like really in the U.S. you just get more career opportunities. He very much spent a lot of the book remarking on this theme of how America is known as this place where you can pursue your passion and you can just do anything you want. You can do anything. If you want to be an astronaut, you can become an astronaut. If you want to become a dancer or a comedian, you can. And you're saying how in other countries, that's just not practical. Sure, you could become a banker or a lawyer or a medical clerk, but there's a very limited amount of things, and everything beyond that, according to the Asian custom, was along the philosophy of if you try and pursue your passion, you're going to end up homeless. You try and pursue the arts, you're never going to make any money, so don't do that. And I think a lot of the book center around his kind of uh, battle with that because he was this guy who really idolized and marveled at the American dream, but on the flip side, he also kind of uh, battled with that Asian stereotype and philosophy that his parents instilled in him. I found it also interesting because it got more complicated. I think um, when they arrived in the US, his mom really could never adjust. Uh, his mom was not able to speak any English and had a very hard time trying to join any local communities. So she essentially just stayed at home and it was very tough for her. But back in Shanghai, her mom was like this, his mom was this high achieving uh, woman who could have stayed at home as a stay at home mom, but because of her initiative and ability, chose to get a job at this like fancy high class clothing store as a general manager. So it was a very hard time for her mom, and definitely reminded me of some relatives I had. I think it reminded me of my grandmother who came here to raise me and my siblings when they were born, and that was very tough for her because she had a lot more control, from what I'm told, back in China. But now a lot of that was taken away, and her life, her whole livelihood, was essentially like stay in the house 24/7, and like she can't drive, she can't speak the language, and she never really fully assimilated into any local communities until after a couple years. Um, she started joining us for church in our local Chinese church. So I can only imagine how tough that would be if I had to move somewhere else and I could just not socially connect with anyone, and I just had to like stay locked up for for a while. So long story short, Jimmy's mom ended up accepting a big offer for another uh, manager position at a new clothing store that was opened up by some fancy famous person. And yeah, I have to remark on how honest and vulnerable and brutally honest Jimmy was throughout the book. He told it like it is, even if it wasn't pretty. He talked about how he cried and he begged his mom not to leave, and his dad, who also wasn't making much money, actually had a lot of credit card debt, uh, told her to stay because family was most important, but she made up her mind and she ended up staying in China for the next 10 years, visiting 1 month every year. But even then, like Jimmy just, you know, was turned off from it because to him it felt like he was, she was just gone, and the 1 month return was so short that he didn't even register it. That was also something that I mean I found relatable. I hope some people do too, whether you're Asian or not, because sometimes you do get family members, maybe from when you're young. I had certain situations like that where because of life or career or what they wanted to pursue themselves, they ended up living far, far away from you. And that's the world of globalization we live in now. And it kind of sucks. I'm not going to get too much into it on my own life, but I will say that um, it was a little more than a little tough for me and my family members because, like, I had a direct family member who did move far away, uh, and that's very tough to deal with sometimes. But you have to deal with it and move on. I think the difference between me and Jimmy was that um, I was never like against it, like blatantly or explicitly. I wasn't like you need to keep the family together or whatnot. Um, I respected the decision, and I partially knew where it was coming from. Um, and it came from a place of putting food on the table as well as pursuing entrepreneurial dreams. So, in a similar way, Jimmy was confused when his mom left because his mom had technically pursued the American dream by making that move. Because in Jimmy's head throughout the book, he has this idea of America, pursue whatever you want to do, and then China is about family first, obeying your parents, respecting your elders, and getting a safe, practical job. And he saw his mom as basically pursuing her own passion instead of family, which kind of screwed a bit with his head on what is right and wrong. I personally don't see it as so binary. I think in every culture and company, you have a spectrum. Sorry, every culture and country, you have a spectrum of both. You have some people who are kind of pursuing more of their passion, and some people kind of pursuing more traditional cultural goals, and maybe a different percentage of how many of each and to what degree. So I don't necessarily see it as that binary. But it was interesting, and it wasn't like cut and dry, simple as her pursuing her passion either. Jimmy remarked on how his mom would make a lot more money than the like minimal wage bank teller job that she was able to get in the States because of how little English she knew. So financially, and they needed help because apparently I think they were in credit card debt. Because of all that, it would have also been a financial decision, but also probably good for her mental health too, being all locked away in the States with like no one around. Now, I think another thing that I found very interesting in the book was how he was kind of disappointed when he first landed in, I believe it was Los Angeles or the Beverly Hills area, because it looked nothing like he imagined it. And basically said in the book how he thought he would live next to Angelina Jolie, and he'd be in a mansion of some sort, and the streets would be lined with mansions. And instead, even in Beverly Hills, which is known even throughout the country as this real fancy rich area, turns out that wasn't the case. They lived in a very dingy, poor 3-story apartment uh, on the edge of Beverly Hills. And so the whole thing was a mess, and it was like not what he envisioned. And it reminded me of when I read Arnold Schwarzenegger's autobiography, where a very similar thing happened with him, because Arnold had known of the US mostly through advertisements, videos, commercials, movies. And so when he finally landed in the United States from his home country of Austria, and he saw California and Hollywood, he was severely disappointed. It was basically just these long, short buildings. And with Jimmy, he came from Shanghai, so he was more familiar with this like fancy kind of sardine packed city life where all the buildings would be like 70 stories high because that's the only way you could fit so many people in there. And instead, uh, I guess California and where he lived, everything was like short, like 1 or 2 story buildings because I guess they had more space to fit everyone in and a smaller population. So I found that very interesting for myself as well because I think with both of them, you get these expectations of how glamorous the US is, and then you're hit with reality, which can be kind of depressing. And that's something I don't like either, because for me, I get very sad whenever I'm around slow paced areas, like a slow paced town center, because I'm just like, is this all there is to my life? This slow paced, boring town center where the best thing that happens is maybe one restaurant updates their menu. And I think it's kind of a lesson in understanding that some of the magic of the U.S. is not necessarily in the glamour of the buildings. People assume it is, but it's really the magic within, and that's within the opportunities, the things you don't necessarily see on a tangible level. Sure, the buildings may not be as glamorous as New York City, but the career opportunities, the freedom, I think that's maybe why immigrants flock to this country. I don't know. But I'm hoping there's something else out there for me as well, because, yeah, I think uh, I also have big dreams, high hopes and dreams, and we'll see where that leads. And it is kind of depressing when you go to these places and you're like, wow, not as great as you think. Um, but, I think there were a lot of things later on where he really did start to severely enjoy the American culture. So then he goes on to talk about middle school and high school, and it's a very comical, entertaining, and educational journey. He gets caught up with a lot of American slang that doesn't make sense at first. He's told what's up, and he keeps looking up, thinking it's about something in the sky, but turns out it's a American greeting. And then he also is, you know, told, "How are you doing?" He's told like, "Pull down your pants." He's made fun of for his tidy whities, and he quickly learns he has to assimilate because he's the one like Asian Chinese kid at the school. I think there were a few Korean kids, and we went up to them, thought he could talk to them. Turns out they weren't Chinese, and then he kind of whimpered away. So he makes a note that he's actually thankful for this because if he did find a group of just Chinese people, he would have just kind of gravitated to them and then ended up never assimilating, learning American English. And he jokes he would have ended up as that guy selling dim sum at the restaurant nearby if he had just kind of stayed in that comfort zone bubble. So essentially, because he was forced to assimilate, he really kind of became, I guess, a lot more American in that sense. Now, this is a part I do want to address because I think I see a lot of angst online, on TikTok, on elsewhere, talking about how, oh, I'm Asian American, but Americans don't see me as Asian. And if I go back to Korea or China, the Koreans don't see me as one of them either. They see me as someone who came from America. And I don't have an identity and it sucks and so forth. Now I have to tell you that you do have an identity. You are truly an American. You are accepted here. You're also Asian. You're both. And it's important to be proud of that rather than ashamed or embarrassed about that. It's important to be, you know, interested and learn more and stay plugged into both cultures. And sure, I think there's people who may not see you as American, but from my life, I've learned that there are some people who will. They'll look at you, they'll treat you, they'll respect you, they'll talk to you as an American first. And it may not be everyone, but it's not no one. And if you haven't found them, maybe you're overlooking them or forgetting about them and focusing on those who treated you badly. But they're out there. I just wanted to put that out there because I think that's important and sometimes missed. Anyhow, back to Jimmy. So Jimmy, yeah, basically starts to find out a bunch of things that he really loves about America. He goes to El Pollo Loco and loves it. He doesn't speak English well then, so he doesn't even know that those aren't English words. He just thinks that they're English words he hasn't learned yet. But he's just amazed at the variety of food and uh, salsa and stuff like that. And his grandpa, who brings him there, says, "You can choose between a dark and white meat. The Americans choose the white meat. And that's stupid because the white meat is dry and tasteless and only for stupid Americans. Always choose the dark meat, it tastes better." And I found that a little hilarious because, yeah, I mean, that grandpa is just very harsh with his words. And maybe Jimmy's playing it up a bit, but um, yeah, I think stuff like that happens. Not everyone. I think there's plenty of friendly, kind Asians too, but like, yeah, I think sometimes, yeah, Asian relatives can be rather harsh or kind of judgmental a bit to other people, and it's a bit too much sometimes. Um, but yeah, he really starts to enjoy a lot of things about America, which I found very interesting. He got really into football. Someone taught him football, and now he's like part of three fantasy football teams and leagues and stuff like that. I was never one to get into football, but it was always around me. You know, a, a certain group of male classmates were always talking about football. He also got really into BET, which was, I think it stands for Black Entertainment TV, which is a like entertainment TV channel that used to be very big, and it would basically, you know, play music videos of very big African American musicians. So he got very much into Dr. Dre and Kanye West and Jay Z and Snoop Dogg, and he would get really into that. He even formed a rap band, rap team around that. And then since he was so bad at rapping, he eventually got phased out of that, but then he started another one. And I think what I admire about his memoir is, you know, almost all the time, I think there's like maybe one time where I caught him maybe holding back a bit, but 99% of the time he was brutally honest in the book, saying stuff he hadn't even told his parents before. Like he mentioned the height of his music production success when he was like really into rapping was when one of his beats got picked up and paid for by a porn website, which I found like hilarious. But you know, he made all these jokes about that, and then he also goes on to talk about like some of his side jobs after college, which were like apparently hidden from his parents. He was a strip club DJ for I think a couple years, which was also very interesting. So yeah, I think what I also found cool was his high school struggles and college struggles, because I think, at least for me, they were very relatable, and you don't always get that story. But yeah, he didn't go to prom because he didn't have a date, and he never regretted it. I think one of his friends, mom or something, offered to pay for and all the expenses for his prom because she didn't want him to regret it, but he kept declining because he didn't have a date, and even if it was all expenses paid, it still would have looked so embarrassing without a date. And he never felt like he regretted it because he just didn't feel like it was a big thing for him. And that was very relatable to me because I think, um, unfortunately, one of the tough times in my life was high school, and it was tougher than him, and it kind of sucked. But I was really at like the bottom of the social ladder, at least in my perception, because I didn't think I had many friends, and I would often eat in the cafeteria alone. Looking back, I wonder like if some of that was in my own head, because I was always waiting for someone to come up to me and talk. And there were a few times I went up to others and tried to make friends and talk, and it didn't always work out, so I stopped trying. But it was a very tough time for me, and naturally I didn't go to prom, and for that reason, I actually remember distinctly playing Maple Story, a video game, on prom night, and he had a similar thing. I think he was playing video games with his dad or something on prom night. Uh, and so he didn't regret that. He also talked about how he really got into football and tried to attempt to join the football team, but his dad kind of laughed him off it and said, "You got no chance." My dad was actually kind of similar in that sense. I actually, for a fleeting moment, thought I could join, and yeah, he kind of laughed me off of it. Possibly rightfully so. I think the football players were a lot larger than me, and I probably had that thought only because I wanted the status that came with it, to be honest. And that's one thing I really liked about this book. It was brutally honest about why he did things. And sometimes he did things just because he wanted the status or the American dream that came with it. I think throughout the book he basically said like he wanted this dream of just like having this awesome rock star life, partying it up and hooking up with a lot of women and having that American dream of like pursuing the the job you wanted. And while I think that's a running theme of his life, I felt like he also like seemed to have a upbeat attitude throughout it to an extent, even when that never really coalesced. So, for example, like after college, he basically didn't have that at all, and it was kind of like a mess. He was a used car salesman. He was a stand-up comedian for fun, and then he was a strip club DJ. And it was interesting because he did all these things kind of to put food on the table, but also in a haphazard way because he would rather do that than take a job that would pay him decently, but he hated. And that's exactly what he turned down. He basically had an internship thanks to his father, who was a financial advisor at like the top like financial bank in San Diego, and apparently he did a really good job. And the person who was managing him was like this hotshot who was managing like a couple celebrities, including the former actor behind Hercules. And basically, he kind of like did a really good job, got a job offer. His dad was thrilled, and he turned it down. His dad was pissed, but he hated the job. Yes, it paid decently, but he hated the idea of just sitting behind a desk every day for the rest of his life. So for him, he felt like it wasn't even a choice. It was simply like he could not do that, and he would rather try and fail than never try at all. So I found that very interesting, and I admire him because, um, like, yes, he was still bumbling around trying to find his way in the dark after that, but at least he found a path to pursue what he loved. And for me, while I kind of did that, I also kind of was like looking for stuff that would put food on the table. I was more in the middle of that spectrum rather than him just kind of going all into it. And so from there, he joined a group of stand-up comedians. I think he went to every stand-up comedian place in the San Diego area where he lived, um, to find anywhere where they would take him to do open mics. And then he found like his one true group of, I guess, friends, because apparently comedy is like the one place where they don't look at your race or color or background or anything. If you're funny, you're funny. If you're not, you're not. And so he found humor to be the one place where he, I guess, found an identity and felt like he belonged. Um, but it like barely paid him. Like he would spend the whole day there checking people in, setting up tables, sending out brochures, and he would only get like $40 a week for all of it. So he kind of lived off ramen, and his main life, which was basically living with his dad, who had retired to a retirement center in San Diego, was really depressing. And that was very relatable to an extent too. Not because of the retirement center thing, um, but to the whole idea and environment of just living in a very slow-paced, boring life. And he hated it. Apparently, a lot of the everyone around him was super old, and he had this one heard this one conversation where two grandparents were conversing about what age they stopped having their period, and it was just very kind of dull and drab for him. So he's trying to get out of this place, and it seems like it took a while. So he did the comedy stuff for a while on the side, but then he needed to get a real job. So he had such low self-esteem, he didn't think he would get any job. But then one of his comedian friends said, "Hey, everyone likes you. Just ask around." And he asked, the first person he asked gave him a job as a used car salesman, which he did for a bit until he found out that most of his comedian friends had slept with like double or triple digits in women, and he was just like blown away. And to him, that was the American dream, hooking up with all these people. And he was like, how is that even possible? And he heard one of them say that uh, most of the people he'd hook up with was through his time as a strip club DJ. So naturally, Jimmy decides to pursue that job as well for the pure goal of basically hooking up with more people, since I think he had only slept with one other person. I found this part of his life interesting. Um, I'm not going to say it was right or wrong, or if his thinking is flawed. Like, that's a discussion for another day. And I'm not here to judge around that, but um, it was just interesting and entertaining for me because, I think on certain levels I do relate. Like, we're all kind of just trying to pursue a better life to an extent, and here he is kind of bumbling through it and complaining a lot, but also like in some ways just kind of slowly bumbling his way towards, the success he's at now, which is very fascinating. And what was interesting about this stage of his life was that he found out the life of a strip club DJ was actually uh, a lot more mediocre than you think. Basically, turns out like the strip club uh, lounge area that you work in is like really, really poor. Like, we're talking like things are broken, things need to be fixed. It's in a sketchy part of town. The building looks like it's about to fall down. And then a lot of the women who are in the strip club place are not necessarily like uh, up and coming people. A lot of them fall into that line of work because out of necessity or out of drugs and stuff. So it was kind of sad, and I think the I guess toughest part was that he did not increase his dating chances through the whole thing. He essentially uh, just became like the friend zone guy, where like he'd be talking to all these women who were naked, but they would be complaining about their boyfriends to him, and he would be the nice guy who just kind of like soaks it all up. And I think it really got me thinking too, just about that whole environment. And I think, it got me thinking about how it's not about just being in an environment where there's more women. It's about being a desirable person in that environment. And I feel like maybe Jimmy didn't have that. Maybe I wouldn't have that either. So part of it made sense, but it was also like kind of crappy situation to be in. So essentially, he eventually quit that because it started to get more sketchy and uh, kind of, he was over it. He was offered to run the a whole new strip club joint that was opening up because of how well he was doing. Uh, but you know, he looked around and he saw like a bunch of people like basically doing sketchy stuff. He called them gangsters a lot, and he wanted to be a gangster for his whole life, having watched BET for so long and so forth. But when he saw it face to face and like all like the drugs and like the sketchy stuff, and then on Christmas Eve, I believe, he was working because he had nothing else to do, and he saw some of the his employees get upset and basically beat up some customers because they came late and they talked a lot of crap and they stayed around, and even though they were already closed, and they were complaining about them closing early. And he was like, man, this is a whole mess where like they're basically fighting and beating each other up, and like what's going on, like is this where I want to be? I got to get out while I can. And so I just found this fascinating because I think he says something that stuck with me. He said like a lot of the gangsters and stuff he met or saw here, um, they fell into that line of work and that life out of necessity rather than because they wanted to. If they could, they would gladly choose a swanky job in an office with a collared shirt, but because of essentially their life and circumstances and drugs or some combination of that, they fell into this life that they live. So I kind of want to wrap it up here by basically giving my final thoughts, and maybe if this is entertaining enough, I could do a part two because I could talk about this for a lot longer. But I think Jimmy's life, I think it's raw, it's honorable, and I'm glad he wrote this because some people might be like, "Oh, my life's too pathetic, it's too boring. Like, who would actually care about this?" But I actually do, and it just goes to show you that I need to hear that my life, your life, doesn't need to be this super interesting thing. It could be sometimes kind of pathetic, but people can relate, and that's what I guess people really care about sometimes. And I don't know. I think it was very relatable for me because he talked about college and how someone told him that college is the best years of your life, and he didn't like that because his college life sucked, and it it just sets you up for like failure because you're basically putting all this pressure, and then you're telling that person it's all downhill after college. And for me, I think it was kind of similar in the sense that like my college life was not necessarily as not really epic compared to my expectations. Where he basically didn't do anything in college, he got poor grades and he smoked a lot of weed because there's nothing to do, and his school sucked and his sports team sucked, so there was really no sporting events to attend. For me, it was different. I didn't do drugs, but really, I had this all this ideas and expectations of partying and women. Instead, there was none of that. I wasn't cool enough, and so I just spent a lot of my free time trying to make friends or do things, but ultimately failing and spending a lot of it just like playing video games with others or by myself or watching TV. And I wasn't alone. A lot of other classmates were similar. It wasn't this, you know, party central thing. And so in that sense, I've just found it very relatable. College wasn't as epic in that vein. And so I don't know. I feel like sometimes you just gotta make the most of it. Like if I could go back, I would complain less. I would kind of lower my expectations in the partying and women department. But I would have gone to a couple more sporting event games because my school had some decent teams, and his and Jimmy's didn't. And you know a couple people did encourage me to, but I never did. I just kind of chose to skip them because I wasn't big into sports. So yeah, I think in general I found his story very revealing, very honest, relatable too in some ways. In others, not as much. I wasn't as big a fan of BET, although I was a fan of hip hop and pop. Um, and his life took a few different turns than mine did because he was very much into comedy and he didn't have any prospects whereas I kind of tried to get some type of stable job as soon as possible, and it didn't come quickly, but it did eventually come after like a year and a half of hunting. Um, so I think I'm not gonna say that you know go follow your passion just like Jimmy did, and you'll eventually stumble into wealth and fame and a job you love. I wouldn't say Jimmy would say the same thing either. But I will say that Jimmy definitely knew that he had to try, and if he failed, that was fine. But he had to try and find out. And maybe there's something behind that that you can take away too. And that's essentially that you should try and fail as well. And maybe, for me, I don't know if I could just quit my job and do that, but maybe you can do something on the side and test the waters while still having something stable to put food on your table. Maybe that's a good compromise. But, there's definitely certain parts of his life that I just found very interesting. And I mean, the level of honesty and vulnerability of this book is just interesting. And the brutal, witty way he tells it is well worth the read. I love the audiobook version because he adds in a few extra jokes. And yeah, it's just a interesting story. It's almost a story that says it's okay, it's okay if you're like me. Like, and yeah, there's some things I'm not like him. I don't do drugs. Uh, I I think he's definitely more of a drinker and partier. But despite those, there's enough relatability to say that the book's almost speaking to me and saying, hey, it's okay. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be Brad Pitt. You don't have to have this perfect life. And this was my chaotic immigrant dream life, and I learned a lot, and I learned to really love America. But it was kind of all over the place, and that's okay. And you can find humor, entertainment, and all that. And that's one thing that I'm trying to take away from it because I think I tend to take my failures more seriously. Like Jimmy, yeah, he was complaining a lot about how crappy he was, living a crappy life, eating ramen every day, living off $40 a week in a retirement home. But I don't know, he still has some level of upbeat nature to it, wittiness to it that I wouldn't necessarily have had back then. I would have been taking it way too seriously about how crappy my situation was. And I think you need a bit of that to be resilient and get through it. So I'm working through that even to this day. Hopefully that will help you. I think the last thing I want to say is I want to leave off with another interesting scene in the book, and it was basically the loss of innocence scene where basically Jimmy loses his innocence or his naivete in a sense, where he basically was he developed a huge crush on this one girl, one stripper at the strip club joint that he DJ'd at. And this girl was like the girl next door type, good girl type who had a good life. And Jimmy felt like she was the one person who didn't really deserve to be at the strip club and the type that he would marry and just a good down to earth girl. and he was super friendly with her, and they got along well. And uh, essentially, she would even like often talk to him or ask him to play certain songs when she was like butt naked uh, at work. And you know, I think he felt like he had a little bit of a chance, and but he was always too scared to ask her out or anything. And this went on for weeks. And then finally one day he kind of like pushed himself to do it, and he was like, "Hey, what are you doing after this?" And she replied, "Oh, I'm going to be hanging out with my boyfriend," which really deflated him because now she had a boyfriend. And so he still ended up being hopeful, kind of wishing, pining for weeks after, hoping that she would break up with her boyfriend. But, you know, he ultimately realized that she was basically just doing the strip club work as a job, and she treated Jimmy as just a friend, and that was that. And it was essentially all it was. And then he lost his innocence because he went to the manager of the whole establishment, who, according to the book, was called Shooter, but apparently he has another name in real life that was anonymized for this book. And Shooter was basically like, yeah, that girl is a chronic pathological liar. Uh, don't trust a word that comes out of her mouth. And Jimmy was like so shocked when that was brought up in conversation. She was like, he was like, what? She's a pathological liar? No way. Like she's cool. And then Shooter was like, yeah, no, like I know this because I slept with her. And basically, Shooter was like a 55 plus 60-year-old man who kind of runs the place. And so basically, Jimmy just kind of was like, whoa. And he basically describes it colloquially as, and then I lost my innocence. And I moved on to the next chapter. And for that, I found that relatable too. Um, it was shocking to me, but also, it was relatable because I felt like in college, something similar happened to me where I assumed all women, or at least women who looked innocent and kind and friendly and nice, were not sexual beings and wouldn't do immoral stuff. And I had a crush on this one girl. And then later on, uh, after the semester was over, I found out in the start of the next semester basically that, oh no, she she hooked up and did some nasty stuff with this other guy on the floor who was not the most handsome or anything, but very definitely more grungy, uh, broke more rules, did drugs, and kind of more of like a grungy type of guy. Wore darker clothes and stuff, and she was this more like upbeat girl, dressed nicely, dressed in more like preppy ways, and I was just like, whoa! I was shocked, and I felt like uh, my world had shattered. And I think it was just similar to Jimmy's story because it was just like, yeah, like your innocent perceptions of how people are aren't necessarily how they are. And yeah, maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah, it's totally fine for women to be sexual, and that's great, in fact. But it's more of this thing where it's like, yeah, it's not all roses and sunshine, and you know, it's not gonna be like a happily ever after for you. So on the good side, though, if you check Jimmy's Instagram these days, he has what seems to be a great life, a great girlfriend too, and things are on the up and up. So there's hope for us all, right? Like seems like all those things that he had real struggles with may have been eventually resolved. Yeah, I was watching an interview of him um, promoting Love Hard, the movie, and one of his themes was like, he thinks the movie really pushes this idea of like be honest and be yourself, and he agrees with that. He says he used to think that like no one would really like him as himself because like he's just this dorky guy. But there are people out there who like you as you are. Now, of course, some might say, oh, well, he's famous now, so he's using that. But I don't know. I feel like maybe not. I think everyone finds a wife. There's Uber drivers, garbage people, everyone, no matter your status, who finds an equal partner if you're willing and open to look for them. So maybe there really is someone for everyone. Who knows? See you later. Thanks for listening.